and the stories told with guns.
Welcome to a literally freezing day out in the shop, but what is also our first project introduction video of 2025. It's also going to be the first 0% project that we tackle. If you remember back to my 2024 mission statement, I had mentioned that I promised to make 2025 the year of the 0%, the scratch build. And this is how we are going to start that. So what is it? Well, it's a Ruger Mark Series pistol. Specifically, it is a Mark II or Mark III series pistol. I believe technically you might be able to make a Mark I with it as well. But parts for that, and we'll get into parts in a little bit, parts for that are going to be a little more difficult to find just because they are so dang old. This build series is sponsored by Matrix Precision, so be sure to check them out. Also, like and subscribe so the algorithm bothers to actually show this build to other people. A little introduction. When I first saw that there was a jig out that allowed you to turn simple tubing into a Mark Series pistol receiver, I wasn't too terribly excited. I do like 22. But I didn't really feel a need for another 22 pistol. It's like you got one, you kind of have them all. And then I started doing some digging, and my opinion changed very quickly. And that changed for two main reasons. One, as far as I can tell, this is the only method to make a 0% that is not a 3D printed result, that does not require heavy machinery. So that alone really sparked my interest. It's like, hey, that is highly unique. The second reason I gained interest is I started doing a deep dive on these particular guns. So let's go into a little bit of the history on them, how they work, and why that made this an interesting project for me. So I think the first most interesting thing to talk about is the fact that on a Ruger Mark Series style weapon, the legal gun, the receiver, is not the pistol grip that actually houses the trigger and the firing mechanisms like the hammer and whatnot. I don't know how it ended up this way, but it's actually the upper, where you've got the barrel and the bolt. And because of that, the nature of how it is built actually makes it a prime candidate, as you'll see throughout this series, for being a 0%. The other thing that's really interesting about these weapons is how long they've been around. So the first, it wasn't even called the Mark Series back then. The first version of this gun was just the Ruger Standard, and it came out in, I believe, 1949. So these things have been around for a long time. And it quickly became, with some minor changes, the Mark I. Like I said, we're not going to really focus on the Mark I much because those are still very, very old, and so you're really not going to encounter parts for them frequently. But Mark I, Mark II, Mark III, Mark IV are characterized by essentially just minor incremental innovation. For example, you've got the Mark II pistol, which has a standard bolt, and it has this weird bottom of the magazine, like old European style magazine release mechanism. When you see the evolution from the Mark II to the Mark III, Ruger has moved that magazine release from the bottom of the hilt of the grip up to where you would generally expect it on a pistol. They also then added some safety compliance features, probably to appease California, such as a loaded chamber indicator and a magazine disconnect that makes it so the gun won't fire if there's no magazine in it. I'll be honest, a lot of people just remove those. So really the only main functional difference for most people between the Mark II and the Mark III is the position of the magazine release to a more efficient and manual of arms familiar location. And then you've got the jump between the Mark III and the Mark IV. And that's where the biggest change happened, and why this whole project isn't even going to touch the Mark IV with a 10-foot pole. And that's because Ruger drastically changed the mechanism with which the upper attaches to the lower. And so for the first time in Ruger Mark series history, we start to finally get into a space where there's drastic parts incompatibility between series. Like I said, they drastically changed how the two main pieces of the firearm attach together. But I mentioned parts compatibility, so let's talk about that. One of the great things about I believe Mark I, don't quote me on that, but the Mark II and Mark III for sure, is just how many parts end up being compatible between the various versions of the series. A big win in that space is going to be things like your bolts. Most of the series, including actually the Mark IV, like I can throw these bolts in the Mark IV and they're going to work just fine. So the bolts, you get extreme heavy use out of them across multiple series. And as you can see here, this is a standard Ruger bolt. But here I've got a much nicer silver PVD coated version from Matrix Precision. And I point that out to say that there is a lot of aftermarket support, not for the 0%, but for the builds in general. So you can get some cool, better parts for these things if you want to do fancy upgrades. And like I said, there's a lot of cross compatibility. So for example, if you wanted to use a Mark II bolt in a Mark III, you just throw it in. Same thing for Mark II or Mark III bolts in a Mark IV. The magazines, as long as you're going between a standard grip angle and a standard grip angle, are generally fairly compatible. Backwards compatibility, I believe, is better than forwards compatibility. So your Mark IV magazines are going to work more seamlessly with lower Mark series than the other direction, and that apparently has to do with the base plates, but you can replace base plates. So again, there's a lot of cross compatibility, and except for, like I told you about the different things that changed over the Mark series, except for the parts that directly affect those features and functions that they added along the way, everything else, again, works together fairly seamlessly. Like, go ahead and take a Mark III upper and put it on a Mark II lower, or vice versa. Make a Mark III upper and throw a Mark II barrel in it. So really just a lot of fun to be had if you know kind of the rules of what works together and what doesn't. For the history portion of this intro, I want to mention one last thing. I hinted at something called the 2245 versus the standard grip angle. And that's because the standard Ruger Mark series grip angle is fairly aggressive. And a lot of people weren't used to that high rake angle that it has. And so Ruger eventually introduced the 2245, 22 being it's still a 22 caliber weapon, but /45, meaning it's got the same grip angle as your favorite 45 caliber weapon, also known as the 1911. What also happens there is that does mean we again have some parts compatibility concerns, the largest of which is the magazines. Because of the drastic difference in these grip angles, you are not going to have compatibility between the 2245 Mark series magazines and the standard Mark series magazines. So just keep that in mind. For the next section of our discussion, and to really delve deep into why this project is so dang interesting to me, we're going to need the help of some previous projects. Back in the late 1800s, early 1900s really, a style of delayed action for handguns was invented that is generally referred to as the Browning tilting barrel action. The reason I bring this up is almost universally, that is how all handguns are made today. Basically, what happens is when you have a ignition of a cartridge, it creates extremely high pressures within the chamber and therefore also the barrel as the projectile moves down. And those pressures remain extremely high until the projectile exits the barrel. Because of that, you really don't want the breech to unlock and open up, thus allowing chamber pressure to violently exit until the bullet has left. If that were to happen, you'd have safety concerns, you'd blow out cases, you'd hurt the gun. You really want all of the pressure to follow the bullet and exit the muzzle, not only for the safety reasons, but also you don't want to waste that chamber pressure and lose velocity because of it. The way that the Browning tilting barrel action achieves that is, if you remember this series, we have the locking lugs on the top of the barrel that lock in at the top of the slide. And then we have our link below the barrel that goes around this pin. What is happening there is, watch closely as I move this barrel backwards. And yes, these have all been safety checked. The barrel stays with the slide. As I move it back, you'll see that for 1/8 of an inch-ish, the barrel stays with the slide. It's moving together. It's keeping that breech locked. It's only after I pass a certain threshold that the link starts to pivot due to its length, and that causes the barrel to be pulled down, hence tilting. And that is what allows the chamber to open up. There you go. You see it? It hits that wall and boom, it starts to get pulled down. It tilts. The reason for that is that 1/8 of an inch-ish, don't quote me on that number, but that is far enough in movement based on the mass of this system to know that the projectile has left the barrel and it is safe to open the breech. Fantastic design, so good, basically everyone uses it now. Point in case, we have our standard Glock style pistol as well. While this does not have a link and it does not have multiple lugs that match with recesses in the top of the slide, we do have, if you examine the geometry of this section of the barrel underneath your chamber, we have a similar mechanism going on to the link that allows the barrel to follow the slide back for a certain amount before the pressures, there's like an angled section, force the barrel down on your locking block and get it out of the way. We also have up here a ledge at the edge of the top of the barrel hood, and that is what works similarly to the lugs in our 1911 to make sure that the barrel stays with the slide as it moves back for that first section. Why is that so interesting? Because the Ruger Mark Series pistols don't work like this at all. Yeah, there's a couple other guns that don't as well, like the Beretta 92 series technically doesn't have a tilting barrel, but it has a falling block that does the same exact thing as the Browning tilting barrel style action. So it's pretty dang close anyways. Meanwhile, the way that the Ruger Mark series works is, because 22 is such a low pressure round, all that's happening inside here is you've got your bolt sitting inside the receiver, and the bolt is heavy enough, and the spring pressure on your recoil spring here provides enough back pressure that alone, the mass, so the inertia and the spring force, is enough to ensure that by the time the forces from the projectile moving down the barrel from that ignition are large enough to push this bolt back and open the breech, it's guaranteed that the bullet has already left the barrel. So yes, it is a little bit a factor of the caliber we're using, but I just thought it was fascinating that it doesn't use the Browning style action at all. That alone was probably the biggest thing that got me excited about this project. Speaking of chamber pressures, let's talk about what that does to our materials availability. It makes it go through the roof. So not only is the 22LR a fairly low chamber pressure max round, I think it's like 28,000 PSI, which if you look at other cartridges, that's very small. But because of the fact that most of those pressures are contained within the barrel and plugged by that bolt that we were just talking about, that means not only are we dealing with low chamber pressures, but we're dealing with low chamber pressures that have very little impact on the actual receiver in the end. So that means we've got a lot of materials open to us to use. For example, this is 6061 aluminum. It can be had from all sorts of material suppliers. You can get a 1" by 3/4 inch inner diameter tube, and that pretty much gets you where you need to be. Now, the pro with going this route is it's dirt cheap. This is an $11 piece of aluminum, and you could get 2 receivers out of this. However, as you can see, the outside is fairly rough, so you will have to have some way of cleaning that up. Some sort of lathe, drill press you could chuck it into, just something to clean that up and do it in a uniform manner. The other thing is, a lot of times these raw materials, they will come, there's tolerances to be had when you buy raw materials. They're not gonna come with the inside a perfect 0.75 inch diameter. It's going to be a couple thousandths off. Not only that, the optimum inside diameter for one of these things is actually not a perfect 3/4 of an inch. It's 0.754, 0.753, somewhere around there. So if you're going the raw material route, you might have to buy a reamer. As you can see, I was able to find a 0.753 reamer, and that is just another cost you would have to bear. Or for twice the price per receiver of this, you can just buy one that's already perfectly sized and reamed and ready to go, anodized in various colors directly from Matrix Precision. Twice the price, but a lot less labor. And if you don't want to buy an expensive tool like this, even you can find them used on eBay. They're not cheap. That's probably a fantastic route to go. But there's also more exotic materials that were opened up to. So the main characteristic that we're interested in my opinion, for this receiver is low friction lubricity because of that reciprocating bolt. So why not try something exotic like, say, bearing bronze? Some great material options, but there's pros and cons to the various routes. I've even seen some folks using carbon fiber tubing for this project. Not saying I back that decision, but hey, people are doing it. So really opens up a lot of your options in terms of materials availability for a build like this. All right, let's do an unboxing of this thing. I have opened it, but I actually haven't taken anything out of this. So you're seeing it just as I am. All right, looks like we've got a set of instructions. We'll put those aside. Okay, some Vibratite, very similar to Loctite. Ooh, nice, deburring tool. Bunch of packing peanuts, junk. Let's get that out of the way. lots of different bits and taps and stuff. That is very nice. This stuff is just always useful to have around the shop, no matter what you're making. Like, you can never have too many bits and drills and all sorts of stuff like taps. A spot drill looks like. Yeah, maybe include the Allen wrenches. Nice. Okay, tons of screws, I guess, to put things together. This will be an alignment block, another alignment block. Looks like some depth guides. Oh God, this is heavy. What is in here? Plates. We got some plates for the jig. And another little box. Okay, the jig itself. Very cool. I mean, it all looks nice, well made. Looks like it's going to be a fun time. I wanted to close out this video with the discussion on who I think this project is good for. If you are the kind of builder that just wants to build the fastest, cheapest gun you can, this is probably not the project for you. And I say that because, let's even exclude the price of the jig. Let's just talk about parts alone. You're gonna end up paying more to build this than if you bought a cheap Ruger. And the nature of that game is because Ruger does not sell several of the major components, the grip module included, aftermarket. So the only way to get grip modules for these builds is to either buy a used grip module from, say, a decommissioned weapon from like Gunbusters or something, or you can spend a hell of a lot of money getting one of the bougie ones from companies that do make them aftermarket. Or technically Matrix Precision is coming out with one that is pretty decently priced. It's comparable to buying a decommissioned set, but it's obviously new. I haven't seen it yet. It's not out yet, so I really can't talk about it at this point. But this is all to say, this project is not to build the world's cheapest Mark Series pistol. I think this project is really good for a couple of reasons. One, you're just interested in building. Two, you want to build a really nice pistol. Because I do believe that you can probably piece together a high-end Mark Series pistol for cheaper than buying one using this route. Or for someone that wants to do something with some crazier materials, I think that this is obviously a great option for them because there is no other path for that. So either way, I'm excited about this. Decide if this is the type of project for you based on that advice, and I'll see you in the next episode.